Venezuela has just moved to severely restrict oil exports to the United States, cutting off a supply line that American refineries have depended on for decades. This is not a symbolic gesture. This is a calculated strike at the heart of a relationship built on extraction interference and the assumption that Caracas would always bend to pressure. What's happening behind this decision is a complete inversion of power dynamics that Western media refuses to acknowledge. This move threatens to raise fuel costs across the southern United States, disrupt refining operations designed specifically for Venezuelan heavy crude, and signal to every nation under sanctions that economic warfare can be survived and even reversed. You need to understand something crucial here. This is not desperation, this is strategy, and the implications go far beyond oil barrels and shipping routes. But first, we need to understand how Venezuela became the target of the most aggressive economic campaign the United States has waged in the Western Hemisphere in a generation. To understand why this moment is so crucial, we must go back to the late 1990s when Hugo Chavez took power and began reshaping Venezuela's relationship with its own resources. For decades before Chavez, Venezuela operated as a compliant oil supplier to the United States. American companies had significant control over extraction. Refining contracts were favorable to Washington, and the profits flowed northward, while inequality deepened in Caracas and beyond. This was the model. Venezuela produced, America consumed, and the political class in Caracas accepted the arrangement because it kept them in power and kept the system stable. Then Chavez nationalized the oil industry. He redirected revenues towards social programs. He challenged the organization of American states. He built alliances with Cuba, with Russia, with China, and Washington watched as a country it had long considered within its sphere of influence began to drift away. The response was predictable. The United States supported a coup attempt in 2002. When that failed, it began funding opposition groups, applying diplomatic pressure and isolating Venezuela in international forums. But the oil kept flowing. Even as tensions grew, American refineries on the Gulf Coast continued processing hundreds of thousands of barrels of Venezuelan heavy crude every single day. Because those refineries were built for that specific type of oil, switching suppliers is not simple. It requires infrastructure changes, new contracts, and time. So the relationship continued, tense but functional, held together by mutual dependence. Then in 2017, the sanctions era began. The Trump administration imposed restrictions on Venezuelan debt. Then it sanctioned the state oil company PDVSA. Then it froze billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets held in American banks. The Biden administration continued the policy with only minor adjustments. The goal was clear: collapse the Venezuelan economy, force regime change, and reinstall a government friendly to American interests. The sanctions were devastating. Oil production fell from over 3 million barrels per day to below 500,000 at the lowest point. Hyperinflation destroyed savings. Millions fled the country. International trade nearly stopped, yet the government in Caracas survived. It adapted. It found new buyers in China and India. It rebuilt parts of its infrastructure with help from Russia and Iran. And it waited. For decades, this system seemed unshakable. The assumption in Washington was that Venezuela had no choice. Without access to American markets, without the ability to use the dollar for transactions, without international legitimacy, Caracas would eventually capitulate. But something changed. The world began shifting toward multipolarity. Sanctions fatigue set in among U.S. allies. China's Belt and Road Initiative offered an alternative to Western financing. And most importantly, oil prices surged after the war in Ukraine, giving resource-rich nations leverage they had not possessed in years. Now let's look at what actually happened in recent months. In late 2024, the Venezuelan government announced it would prioritize oil exports to Asia and reduce shipments to the United States by more than 60%. This was not framed as retaliation, it was framed as economic pragmatism. Chinese and Indian buyers were offering better terms, paying in currencies other than the dollar and not attaching political conditions to their purchases. Within weeks, Venezuelan crude shipments to U.S. Gulf Coast refineries dropped from roughly 400,000 barrels per day to under 150,000. Refinery operators in Texas and Louisiana began scrambling for alternatives. Some turned to Canadian heavy crude, but the logistics were complicated and the chemistry was different. Others looked to Mexico, but Mexican production has been declining for years and cannot fill the gap. The official statements from Caracas were measured but pointed. Venezuela's oil minister declared that the country would no longer accept being treated as a subordinate supplier. While facing continuous economic warfare, he emphasized that new partnerships with China, India, and other nations offered respect, fair prices, and long-term stability. There was no mention of reversing the decision. There was no negotiation offer. This was presented as a done deal. Meanwhile, American officials downplayed the situation. The State Department said the U.S. energy sector was resilient and could adapt. The Department of Energy pointed to strategic reserves and domestic production increases, but behind the scenes, industry insiders were alarmed. Gulf Coast refineries are not just important, they are critical infrastructure, and they were designed decades ago with Venezuelan heavy crude in mind. Why did this happen now? The answer is a combination of economic calculation, geopolitical opportunity, and domestic political necessity. Economically, Venezuela benefits from selling to buyers who pay more and ask less. China has invested billions in Venezuelan infrastructure, oil fields, and mining projects. Those investments come with purchase agreements that guarantee steady demand. India, hungry for discounted crude amid global price volatility, has become a major buyer. These markets are growing stable and do not threaten sanctions every time there is a political disagreement. Politically, the Venezuelan government needed a win. Years of sanctions have strained the population. Demonstrating that the country can thrive without American approval is essential for domestic legitimacy. This move allows President Maduro to argue that resistance works, that sovereignty is achievable, and that the multi-polar world offers real alternatives from a security perspective. Reducing dependence on the U.S. market also reduces vulnerability. As long as Venezuela relied on American buyers, Washington could use that dependence as leverage. Cutting that tie removes a pressure point. It makes future sanctions less effective. It signals to other nations under similar pressure that decoupling is possible. Ideologically, this fits into a broader narrative that Caracas has been promoting for years. The idea that the era of American dominance is ending, that Latin America can chart its own course. That sovereignty means making decisions based on national interest, not external demands. This move reinforces that narrative and strengthens Venezuela's position as a leader among nations resisting Western hegemony. Let's talk about what traditional media is not reporting. First, this was not a sudden decision. Venezuela has been quietly diversifying its export markets for more than 3 years. Agreements with Chinese state oil companies were signed as early as 2021. Indian refiners began increasing purchases in 2022. What you are seeing now is the culmination of a long-term strategy, not a reaction to a recent event. Second, this move was coordinated with other actors. There is strong evidence that Russian energy advisors have been working with PDVSA to optimize export logistics and refining partnerships. Iran, which has faced similar sanctions, shared expertise on managing isolated economies and building alternative financial channels. China provided the financing and infrastructure necessary to make the pivot feasible. This was not Venezuela acting alone. This was Venezuela acting as part of a coalition of sanctioned and semi-aligned states building parallel systems. Third, the timing is deliberate. Global oil markets are tight. OPEC Plus has been managing supply carefully. The war in Ukraine disrupted Russian exports to Europe, creating supply chain chaos that still reverberates. U.S. strategic reserves were drawn down significantly and have not been fully replenished. In this environment, losing access to 400,000 barrels per day of heavy crude is not trivial. It puts pressure on prices, it forces costly adjustments, and it exposes the vulnerability of a system that assumed compliant suppliers would always be available. Fourth, this is part of a broader trend. Watch what is happening across Latin America. Mexico is asserting energy sovereignty and limiting foreign investment in its oil sector. Brazil is expanding trade with China and participating in BRICS discussions about alternative currencies. Argentina is exploring yuan-denominated trade deals. Bolivia and Nicaragua are deepening ties with Russia. This is not coincidence. This is a region reevaluating its relationship with Washington and finding that alternatives exist. Fifth, the financial dimension is critical. Venezuela is increasingly conducting oil sales in yuan and rupees and through barter arrangements that bypass the dollar entirely. This reduces the effectiveness of U.S. financial sanctions and contributes to the gradual erosion of dollar dominance in global energy markets. Every transaction that occurs outside the dollar system weakens the primary tool of American economic coercion. Six, there is a domestic U.S. angle that is being ignored. Gulf Coast refineries employ tens of thousands of workers. They generate billions in economic activity. Disruptions to their operations have real consequences for real people in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Yet the decision to pursue regime change in Venezuela through sanctions was made with little regard for those consequences. The workers and communities affected by this policy are collateral damage in a geopolitical gamble that is now backfiring. At this point, I need to step back from emotion and look at this through a realist lens. In international relations, states act according to their interests, constrained by their power and the structure of the international system. For decades, the structure was unipolar. The United States was the dominant power economically and militarily. That gave Washington the ability to enforce compliance, punish defiance, and maintain favorable terms of trade. Smaller states had little choice but to accept those terms because resistance meant isolation, economic collapse, or worse. But power is not static. It shifts based on economic growth, technological advancement, military capability, and the willingness of other actors to challenge the status quo. What we are seeing now is a structural shift. The international system is moving from unipolarity toward multipolarity. China has become an economic superpower capable of offering financing, trade, and political cover to nations that defy the West. Russia retains significant military power and energy resources. Regional powers like India, Turkey, and Brazil are asserting independence. In this environment, the costs of defying the United States have decreased and the benefits have increased. Venezuela calculated that it could survive sanctions, rebuild its economy through alternative partnerships, and use its oil resources as leverage in a tight global market. That calculation was correct. The United States, meanwhile, assumed that sanctions would produce regime change or at least force compliance. That assumption was wrong. Sanctions can devastate economies, but they do not automatically produce political outcomes. In fact, they often produce the opposite. They rally domestic support around besieged governments. They create incentives for sanctioned states to cooperate with each other, and they accelerate the development of alternative economic systems that reduce dependence on the West. Venezuela's decision to block oil exports to the United States is a rational response to an irrational policy. Washington treated Venezuela as a subordinate that could be coerced indefinitely. Caracas responded by finding new patrons, new markets, and new sources of legitimacy. The mistake was assuming that economic pain would translate into political surrender. History shows that is rarely the case. States endure extraordinary hardship when their leadership believes survival is at stake, and they become more, not less, resistant to external pressure. There is also the issue of credibility. Once you impose sanctions, lifting them becomes a political problem. It looks like weakness. It rewards defiance. So even when sanctions clearly are not working, governments are reluctant to reverse course. This creates a trap. The policy fails, but admitting failure is too costly. So the policy continues and the failure deepens. Venezuela exploited that trap. It endured the pain, found alternatives, and now operates from a stronger position than it did 5 years ago. Meanwhile, the United States is left with refineries that cannot easily replace Venezuelan crude, higher energy costs, and a diminished reputation for strategic competence. This is not just about Venezuela. The consequences will affect energy markets, regional politics, and the broader trajectory of American influence in Latin America and beyond. On energy markets, the immediate impact is upward pressure on prices. Refineries designed for heavy crude cannot switch to light crude without significant modifications. Canadian and Mexican supplies cannot fully compensate. This means higher costs for gasoline and diesel in the southern United States. particularly in states that rely on Gulf Coast refining capacity. For consumers, this translates to higher prices at the pump. For industries dependent on fuel, this means increased operating costs. The timing could not be worse. With inflation still a concern and economic growth fragile for the entire region, this move signals that defying Washington is not only possible but potentially advantageous. Other countries are watching. If Venezuela can survive the most aggressive sanctions campaign in the hemisphere and come out stronger, what does that mean for U.S. leverage elsewhere? Expect more Latin American governments to test the boundaries. Expect more deals with China. Expect more rhetoric about sovereignty and multipolarity. Expect less automatic alignment with U.S. foreign policy. The era of the Monroe Doctrine, even in its modern forms, is ending. The international financial system faces a slow but accelerating erosion of dollar dominance. Every oil deal conducted in yuan or rupees is a crack in the foundation. Every country that successfully navigates sanctions by building alternative trade networks is proof that the system is not inevitable. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency depends on network effects. It is valuable because everyone uses it, but if enough actors start using alternatives, those network effects weaken. Venezuela is a small player in this drama, but it is part of a larger pattern. Russia sells energy in rubles and yuan. China promotes the yuan for trade settlement. Saudi Arabia discusses non-doll oil sales. These are not isolated events. They are symptoms of a system under stress. In the next 5 to 10 years, we will see more resource-rich countries leveraging tight markets to assert political and economic independence. We will see more cooperation among sanctioned states. We will see more institutions and financial systems designed to operate outside Western control. The BRICS bloc is expanding. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is deepening. Alternative payment systems are being developed. These efforts are still in early stages, but the trajectory is clear. The unipolar world is fragmenting, and the tools that maintained it are losing effectiveness for the United States. This presents a strategic dilemma. Maintaining dominance requires credibility, but credibility requires successful outcomes. When sanctions fail, when coercion backfires, when allies drift away, credibility erodes, and once lost, it is difficult to rebuild. Venezuela has demonstrated that even a relatively small country under immense pressure can resist a superpower if it finds the right partners and waits for the right moment. What we are witnessing is not a temporary disruption, but a fundamental recalibration of power. Caracas is not begging for sanctions relief. It is moving forward without American approval. It is selling oil to buyers who pay fairly and respect sovereignty. It is rebuilding its economy on terms it controls. This move marks a turning point in the Western Hemisphere. For over a century, the United States has treated Latin America as its backyard. That era is ending, not because America chose to step back, but because the conditions that enabled dominance have changed. The unipolar world is dissolving, and Venezuela is positioning itself as a sovereign actor in this new multipolar reality. The question now is not whether other countries will follow, but how many and how quickly. This analysis is based on public information, international relations theories, and the analytical framework of political realism. The interpretations presented are for educational and informational purposes.